They called me paranoid, but tell me, how else would you explain this? The president of our home marched contractors onto land my parents had purchased decades before her little empire even existed. She handed out glossy brochures, smiling as though it was hers to give away, promising neighbors a glittering futuria built on my property, as if I no longer existed. At night, I lay awake listening to engines grinding across my soil, counting headlights sliding past my window, wondering how much they'd strip away before I finally lost it. Call me crazy, but what would you have done? Had trusted the system, or fought back? I stood on my parents' old property holding the yellowed deed from 1978. The ink had faded with time, but the legal language was still sharp. My mom and dad bought these 3 acres and built their modest ranch house 17 years before the Willowbrook HOA ever came into being. Back then, this was farmland scattered with houses. It wasn't until 1995, when developers started filling the area with cookie-cutter homes, that the HOA was born. The boundaries of our land were still marked with old metal stakes, visible if you knew where to look. I had inherited mineral rights, water rights, and every square foot of dirt, and more importantly, I inherited it free of HOA control. Most people don't realize this, but associations only govern properties that willingly sign on to their covenants, conditions, and restrictions. My land existed long before their rules. I was checking the survey markers when voices cut through the trees. Out stepped Susan Peterson, HOA president, with a surveying crew and a county official in tow. She carried herself like her title meant something beyond her subdivision. Without asking, the surveyor was already setting up equipment on my land. The county man looked uneasy, like he'd been given half the story. Susan spotted me and walked over with the polished smile she always used at meetings. "Mr. Grant, perfect timing," she said. "We're planning to optimize this unused space for a community wellness center. The neighborhood really needs a gathering place." Her tone wasn't one of suggestion, it was final, like the decision had already been made. I noticed she carefully avoided saying who exactly had given permission to build on my land. I kept calm. "Interesting project, Susan. Do you happen to have permits for construction on private property?" The surveyor froze mid-adjustment, and the county official shifted nervously. Susan waved a dismissive hand. "HOA projects don't need individual permits. We manage community development through board authority." That was flat out false, and she knew it. Before I could reply, my neighbor Frank Miller called out from his yard. "That's absolutely wrong," he said, walking over. Frank had retired from the county building department after 30 years. His words carried weight. "Every construction project requires permits, especially on private land. Do you even have authorization from the owner?" Susan's smile tightened. She hadn't expected expert resistance so soon. "I don't need authorization. I'm HOA president, and this property falls under our community guidelines." The surveyor and county official exchanged looks. Even they could tell something wasn't right. As Frank studied Susan with folded arms, Mrs. Chen from down the street stopped with her dog. She leaned close to me and whispered, "She pulled this with the Johnsons last year. They had to hire a lawyer to stop her from improving their backyard. Cost them thousands." That explained Susan's arrogance. She'd been testing boundaries and winning. But unlike before in my life, I wasn't going to panic. 5 years ago, when I lost my previous house in a dispute, I would have blown up or wasted money on lawyers I couldn't afford. Not this time. Now, I had patience, knowledge, and a plan. I opened my phone's camera while Susan rambled about community development powers. Every false claim she made was evidence. She was practically confessing while I recorded. Sometimes the best move is letting your opponent dig their own grave. When the moment was right, I asked, "Susan, could you show me the statute that gives HOA presidents power over non-member property?" She blinked, caught off guard. The surveyor quietly began packing up his equipment, clearly unwilling to stick around. Susan tried to recover, her voice turning patronizing. "Mr. Grant, property law can be confusing for laypeople, but as HOA president, I have broad powers for the community's benefit. Your parents' lot has been vacant too long, it needs development." She gestured toward my land like it was abandoned, not my inheritance. I raised the deed high enough for everyone to see. This property predates your HOA by 17 years. You have as much authority here as the mayor of Dallas has over farmland in Oklahoma." The county official buried himself in his clipboard. Frank nodded approvingly. Mrs. Chen whispered to her dog. "I knew it." Susan's expression shifted from confident to calculating. Finally, she muttered, "We'll see about that. I'll be consulting with our attorney." She stormed off, her crew trailing behind. As I watched her retreat, I realized something. She wasn't bluffing, as she genuinely believed she had power she didn't, and that mix of confidence and ignorance meant she was bound to try something reckless. I would be ready, camera in hand, when she did. The very next morning, I spotted her car parked at the county building department. Instead of charging ahead with construction, she was trying to push her plan through official channels. I parked across the street and watched her grow more agitated with each clerk she confronted. Frank happened to be renewing his contractor's license that day, so I texted him. He arrived, and together we observed Susan escalating her arguments with higher-level staff until she finally stormed out, empty-handed and red-faced. When Frank returned, he confirmed what I suspected. She tried to get construction permits on your land, when they told her only deed holders can apply. She argued that HOA presidents have development authority. He shook his head, half laughing. Tom told her no HOA in Texas has any power over non-member property. Later that afternoon, a pickup rolled into my driveway. A middle-aged contractor stepped out, clearly uneasy. "Sir, are you the landowner?" he asked. When I nodded, he unrolled blueprints on his truck hood, hands shaking. "Peterson told me we were building a community wellness center, but these plants a broken bar there for a luxury residence, master suite, gourmet kitchen, 3-car garage, wine cellar. I've built community centers before, none of them had walk-in closets or marble bathrooms. I'm starting to think this is illegal." He looked at me with real concern. "I don't want my company tied up in fraud." Smart man. He'd realized what Susan hadn't. I showed him my deed and inheritance papers. His face drained. "Jesus, a broken bar. She told me the HOA owned this property. She even showed me fake permits and authorization letters." He rolled up the blueprints in disgust. "I'm calling my lawyer and my insurance company. This could ruin my business." Instead of giving up, even after being exposed, Susan Peterson was only getting started. When the contractor backed out, Peterson shifted gears from construction to financial warfare. That afternoon, my phone wouldn't stop ringing at calls from my insurance company, mortgage lender, even the county tax officer, each asking about supposed construction projects and liability risks tied to my estate. Every call twisted my stomach tighter, dragging me back to memories of losing my previous home 5 years earlier. Laura sat nearby, her worry growing with each conversation. The insurance agent sounded baffled by conflicting reports. The mortgage officer expressed alarm over unauthorized modifications that could jeopardize our loan terms. By evening, the pressure was unbearable, the phone a weapon tearing open old wounds of legal and financial battles I thought I'd left behind. After the 7th call, Laura pulled me aside. Her voice was low but urgent. "Jonathan, this isn't just about the land anymore. She's trying to wreck our credit, our reputation, everything. It feels exactly like last time, and I don't think we're ready for this." Her fear reminded me why I had been so meticulous about documenting every move. That night, Peterson appeared at our front door with her husband in tow, clutching a manila folder like it was a trump card. Her husband looked uneasy, as if dragged into something he wanted no part of. Without a greeting, she thrust the folder into my hands. "Mr. Grant, I've uncovered serious financial irregularities that require immediate HOA intervention for the safety of the community." Inside were fabricated documents of phony tax notices and forged liens claiming I owed $12,000 in community maintenance assessments. The formatting was sloppy, the figures didn't match county systems, and the charges were far beyond any legal HOA authority. It was an amateur attempt at forgery, but dangerous nonetheless. As Peterson spun increasingly tangled explanations, Mrs. Chen passed by with her dog and stopped to listen, eyebrows rising in skepticism. Moments later, Frank strolled over from his yard, drawn as if by instinct. One glance at the papers and he called it out plainly. "These are fake. The formatting is wrong. The numbers don't align with county records, and HOAs can't levy charges beyond actual services. This is fraud. His experience reviewing thousands of legitimate documents made his assessment impossible to dismiss. Laura stepped outside, immediately spotting the inconsistencies as well. Her legal training turned her questions into a trap, each one making Peterson more uncomfortable. By the time Peterson left, a husband in tow, folder clutched tight as she had handed me her biggest mistake yet, physical evidence of forgery and fraud. Her web of lies was becoming too tangled to sustain, and every desperate move only added more proof for her eventual downfall. Frank lingered to discuss what we'd witnessed, his face grave. Between the contractor's earlier confession and these forged documents, I now had professional witnesses ready to testify about her deception. Still, I couldn't shake one fear. Would the evidence clear my name, or would Peterson succeed in flipping the narrative and painting me as the villain? 2 weeks later, she found another contractor, this one less concerned with legality and more motivated by Peterson's premium rates. At dawn, the ground shook with a roar of bulldozers. I rushed to the window to see heavy machinery plowing across my property, tearing through soil and gardens that had taken decades to grow. And there stood Peterson, in a hard hat, directing the operation with smug satisfaction. She wasn't waiting for permits. She was betting that if she built quickly enough, possession would outweigh the law. I called Frank immediately. He arrived with his camera and measuring tape, both of us standing at the property line, documenting the trespass. Every hour they work, the damages stack higher, Frank muttered as he photographed the destruction. She thinks speed will bury the law, but she's actually building the evidence against herself. By noon, the crew had cleared a large area and started digging the foundation, not for a community wellness center, but for a luxury home. Word spread quickly, and neighbors began gathering to watch. Some were merely curious, others uneasy at the blatant illegality. Peterson, ever the opportunist, mingled with the crowd, passing out glossy handouts, selling her vision of a wellness center and community hub. She shook hands like a politician at a rally, promising higher property values and new recreational opportunities. Then, the tone shifted. Councilman Rick Torres arrived unannounced, his presence immediately lending an aura of legitimacy. Clearly, Peterson had orchestrated his visit. With re-election looming, Torres was eager for HOA endorsements. In exchange, Peterson offered him unified backing from multiple associations if he supported her projects. His visit wasn't civic, it was a calculated political deal. Standing before the crowd, Peterson raised her voice with the confidence of someone backed by political power. This wellness center represents the kind of forward-thinking development that sets premier communities apart. Property values will rise, families will thrive, and Willowbrook will become a model of sustainable planning. The crowd murmured approvingly, the sound of machinery behind her adding drama to her promises. Torres chimed in with polished rhetoric about economic growth and community progress, carefully sidestepping the issue of property rights. Mrs. Peterson demonstrates the kind of leadership we need, he said. Progress requires tough decisions, even when some resist change. The residents, swayed by the appearance of political backing, began to shift toward her side. I raised my voice. Councilman Torres, who owns the land where this construction is happening? Silence fell. Neighbors glanced between us, waiting for his answer. Torres dodged with practiced smoothness, mumbling about complex legal frameworks and multiple stakeholders. Frank stepped in, flashing his building department credentials. This is private property. There are no permits. Every code violation here adds up daily, and any structure built will need to be torn apart before it could ever pass inspection. But his technical authority couldn't compete with Peterson's promises and Torres's political presence. Peterson quickly framed Frank as an obstructionist, painting his concerns as the kind of thinking that holds neighborhoods back. The crowd, uncomfortable with the growing conflict, began drifting away. Some whispered their private doubts about liability and legality, while others bought into Peterson's vision. The community was splitting into those who valued property rights, and those dazzled by promises of progress. Exactly the kind of division Peterson thrived on. That evening, Laura and I stood side by side in our yard, watching the machines tear apart what was left of my parents' land. Heavy machinery sprawled across our land like an occupying force, floodlights blazing through the night as workers poured concrete without pause. Laura stood beside me, her voice tight with unease. She's locked in now. Every day she keeps this up, her financial stake and liability grow. That only makes her more desperate to justify it by any means, and desperation can be dangerous. She was right. Peterson had crossed the point of no return, and I couldn't shake the doubt. Would my careful strategy of patient documentation hold up against someone who had abandoned the law entirely? That evening, Frank stopped by with troubling news from his contacts in City Hall. He laid out the real reason behind Councilman Torres's blind support. Torres was staring down re-election and needed HOA endorsements to stay in office. Peterson had promised him unified backing from multiple associations if he supported her pet projects. It wasn't about community development, it was about political favors and traded votes. The corruption ran deeper than Peterson. Local officials were choosing convenience and ambition over law and the rights of individual property owners. And now, everything was converging on me. I still couldn't tell if I was the defender of my HOA or the obstacle standing in the way of their machine. The morning after construction began, Peterson escalated from bulldozers to economic warfare. At 7 a.m., my phone rang with the first shot, my insurance company questioning liability coverage for ongoing construction on my property. Within an hour, my kitchen table had become command central. Call after call came in, the mortgage lenders, tax assessors, utilities, even code enforcement, each citing anonymous complaints about unauthorized building and safety violations. The coordination was obvious and deliberate. Every ring of the phone twisted my stomach tighter, dragging me back into memories of losing my last home 5 years earlier. Laura watched, her expression tightening with every conversation until finally, during the pause, she leaned close and whispered, "Jonathan, a broken bar. This is exactly what happened before. Same timing, same tactics, same pressure points. She's not just after your property anymore, she's trying to destroy us financially." Her words cut deep, but they also reminded me why I had been so meticulous with records this time. Peterson was more dangerous than I had imagined. By noon, 3 inspectors had shown up unannounced, clipboards in hand, armed with reports claiming everything from septic failures to fire hazards. One by one, they found nothing. The county building inspector finally sighed in frustration. "Mr. Grant, someone is filing false reports to trigger expensive investigations and possible condemnations. This isn't code enforcement, it's harassment, abuse of process, and we take that seriously." Still, the damage was psychological. Each knock at the door, each official car in the driveway, each clipboard shoved into my hands reopened the trauma of losing everything years ago to people who knew the system better than I did. Laura found me later, sitting at the table surrounded by dismissed violation notices, staring in silence. She put a hand on my shoulder. "You're not who you were 5 years ago. Back then, you didn't understand the system. Now you do, and you have a plan. Don't let her get into your head." But Peterson wasn't finished. She expanded her attack to federal agencies, filing false reports that I was running unreported rentals and evading taxes. The IRS scrutiny could have been devastating if true, but instead it became another expensive and exhausting paper battle. Each false claim was a crime, but the immediate effect was what she wanted: chaos, stress, and fear that one small mistake could spiral into a real problem. Laura called our attorney, who confirmed what we suspected. Peterson has filed dozens of fraudulent complaints. Each one is criminal harassment and abuse of process. But proving intent will mean documenting everything: the timing, the sequence, the whole picture. By late afternoon, the fire department arrived on a false propane hazard report. When no violations were found, the fire marshal's patience snapped. Filing false safety reports is a crime. We're opening an investigation into whoever's behind this. His frustration was real, and I realized Peterson was starting to alienate the very officials she needed. The attacks extended into our finances, credit report inquiries, mortgage disputes, even fabricated claims questioning our ownership. Someone had mapped out every weak point in our financial life. Peterson hadn't improvised these, it was a campaign planned weeks in advance, launched in lockstep with her illegal construction. When the bank's emergency inspector cleared us of any violations, Their investigator pulled me aside. "Someone is contacting multiple lenders with fabricated claims. This is coordinated harassment meant to damage your credit and force compliance. It's financial fraud, and we'll be reporting it." For every lie she told, more evidence stacked against her. Instead of breaking me, Peterson was writing her own indictment. I gathered the reports into neat piles, turning chaos into ammunition. "She thinks she's drowning us," I told Laura, "but she's building our case one false report at a time." That evening, Peterson arrived at my door with a smug smile and a stack of legal papers. She handed them over as if delivering the final blow, a restraining order accusing us of being a threat to community safety and HOA operations. I took the papers, closed the door, and let a slow smile spread across my face. She thought this would be the weapon that finally forced our compliance. She didn't realize every fraudulent document was just another nail in her own coffin. Chapter 5, The Counterattack. I was done waiting for her next move. With Frank's experience and Laura's legal skill, we launched our own investigation. 3 days into construction, Frank and I met in his garage, spreading out HOA bylaws across his workbench. Any expenditure over $500 requires board approval and notification, he said, tapping the regulations. If she's funding this with HOA money, she's crossed into embezzlement. We filed a request for the HOA's complete financial records under Texas nonprofit disclosure laws. The response confirmed everything I suspected and gave us the smoking gun we needed. Peterson had siphoned $47,000 from HOA funds to bankroll her illegal project. Peterson had funneled $47,000 in community funds into her so-called wellness center project, covering architectural plans, construction deposits, legal consultations, and equipment rentals, well beyond her presidential authority. Laura combed through the records with her lawyer's precision. "This isn't just bad judgment," she said, marking the irregularities. "This is systematic embezzlement, personal enrichment disguised as community development. Every dollar misused is a separate crime." Instead of keeping the evidence quiet, I began sharing it with neighbors one by one. Mrs. Chen was the first I approached. Her outrage was immediate. "We pay $600 a year for street maintenance and common upkeep, and not private mansions passed off as a community projects. If she's stealing our money, every homeowner has the right to know." Her anger spread quickly. Within days, word reached households across the neighborhood, and the backlash grew. I prepared a media packet and contacted local outlets. Public exposure, I knew, would be more effective than a private legal fight. Channel 7's investigative reporter Sarah Martinez arrived that same day with a camera crew. As she interviewed neighbors, her team filmed the construction site eating into my property. HOA abuse affects thousands of Texas homeowners, she explained on camera. This case highlights larger issues of community governance and protection of individual rights. The broadcast hit hard. City officials, once content to look the other way, were suddenly forced to take public positions. Councilman Torresa, who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Peterson, vanished from reporters' calls. His political cover collapsed under the glare of television cameras, leaving Peterson more exposed than ever. The evening news aired interviews with neighbors who had learned their dues were misappropriated. Outrage mounted. To channel that momentum, I organized community meetings outside Peterson's influence. Frank offered his garage, and together we educated residents about HOA limits and nonprofit governance. "Most people don't realize where HOA authority ends," Laura told the crowd. "Peterson has violated her fiduciary duty, misappropriated funds, and committed multiple felonies while pretending it was all for the community." The educational push turned concern into organized resistance. Soon after, the district attorney's office launched a formal investigation. Prosecutor David Kim confirmed what we suspected. "Mrs. Peterson's activities show clear signs of systematic embezzlement. We're treating this as a serious white-collar crime with possible federal implications." Even her own attorney abandoned ship. Henderson Walsh Associates withdrew representation after reviewing the evidence. "We cannot ethically represent clients in matters involving clear criminal fraud," he told me. With her guilt obvious and the case public, no lawyer wanted to touch her. Meanwhile, building inspectors began daily visits to her site, citing violation after violation. Each report piled up, demanding costly remediation before permits could ever be issued. I wasn't waiting idly, I was feeding inspectors the evidence they needed to act. Soon, federal investigators stepped in. Peterson had used forged ownership documents to secure loans from national banks that crossed state lines and triggered federal jurisdiction. When false documentation is used with national lenders, it becomes a federal case. An investigator explained, potential sentences can run up to 30 years. It was exactly the escalation I'd hoped for. By now, Peterson's political shield had shattered, her crimes dragged into the light. I watched the evening news one night and realized something important. Offense was stronger than defense. By working with media, officials, and neighbors, I wasn't just protecting myself, I was dismantling her entire power structure. The reporter closed her segment with words that hit home. Tomorrow, Peterson won't just be fighting the homeowner she tried to defraud. She'll be fighting the entire city. She had planned a grand opening for her villa the following weekend. I planned something else at the emergency HOA board meeting I had orchestrated to coincide with it. Over 60 residents packed the community center. Unlike past meetings, this one was structured like a trial, with prepared evidence and testimony. I began by distributing copies of the financial record showing the $47,000 in unauthorized expenditures. Every resident deserves to know how their dues were spent, I announced. Faces hardened as the reality sank in. Some whispered urgent calculations, others folded the papers in silence, and a few stared with grim recognition at Peterson's theft. Board members squirmed. One raised her hand. If we approved spending without proper authority, we're personally liable for negligent oversight. We could be sued. Several announced they would resign unless Peterson accounted for every dollar and ceased her activities immediately. Peterson tried to control the room, but her voice lacked the confidence of old. Even her loyalists avoided her eyes. Then the testimonies began. Mrs. Chen stood first, voice trembling with fury. Peterson came to my home 3 times. Asking me to sign false statements claiming Laura Grant was unstable and a danger to the community. When I refused, she threatened to raise my HOA dues. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mr. Rodriguez followed, his face heavy with shame. I believed her promises of better amenities and higher property values. I even gave her extra money for the project. Now I see I was helping her steal my neighbor's land. Councilman Torres, once her biggest champion, appeared only to distance himself. Community development requires proper procedures and resident approval, he said carefully. It was political doublespeak, but the meaning was clear. He was no longer backing her. Frank presented the building code violations with professional authority, adding weight to the evidence. Then, as if on cue, a county inspector entered the meeting and served Peterson with official stop work orders. This construction must cease immediately, pending resolution of ownership and permits, he declared. The timing was deliberate. I had coordinated with officials to maximize impact. Peterson snapped. This inspector has no authority over community projects, she shouted. Wellness centers follow different regulations. Even her remaining allies stepped back, appalled by her denial of obvious law. At the back of the room, a district attorney's representative took careful notes, his presence a silent reminder. This was no longer just a neighborhood dispute. It was a criminal case in the making. When the district attorney's representative finally raised his head from his notes, the entire room fell into silence. This gathering is not about a neighborhood disagreement, he declared firmly. We are documenting large-scale fraud, embezzlement, and property theft. This is no longer a civil matter, it is now a criminal investigation. The shift was immediate. What had begun as a community meeting suddenly carried the weight of a courtroom proceeding. Local news crews rushed in, filming both the residents' testimonies and the visible violations at the construction site. I had already provided the reporters with meticulously prepared evidence packets, laying out the full picture of Peterson's corruption. This type of abuse of HOA authority affects thousands of homeowners across the state, one reporter explained during live coverage, interviewing shocked neighbors about governance failures and threats to individual property rights. Several residents went on record announcing their intention to pursue civil lawsuits, demanding the return of stolen dues and compensation for damages caused by Peterson's unauthorized construction. At the same time, Bank representatives showed up at the villa to investigate collateral for loans Peterson had fraudulently obtained with forged documents. My reports to the financial institutions had triggered multiple inquiries into falsified applications and ownership papers, which in turn brought federal investigators into the case. Her fraudulent loan applications crossed state lines, drawing national jurisdiction and making her crimes exponentially more serious. I ensured all agencies, building inspectors, the DA's office, federal investigators, and civil litigators were in constant communication, preventing Peterson from stalling the process with delay tactics. When construction crews attempted to continue work despite the stop work orders, they were met by inspectors and law enforcement, all with cameras rolling. Watching it unfold, I recognized the success of my strategy. This wasn't a lone complaint anymore, it was a coordinated offensive, with every level of authority moving in together. Peterson, standing defiantly in the unfinished foundation of her villa, looked on as her political support evaporated and her criminal liability grew. The cameras captured her denial in real time. Tonight she stood,